In the autumn of 1891, the coastal town of Port Harmon, Maine, began to whisper about 13-year-old Clara Whitmore with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. This frail girl, with ink-stained fingers, could draw perfect maps of places she had never visited, reproduce architectural details of buildings she had never seen, and sketch the exact locations of objects that had been lost for years. What modern neuroscience might identify as an exceptional spatial processing disorder was, to the people of 1891, either a divine gift or something far more sinister. But when Clara's drawings began revealing the locations of buried treasure, hidden graves, and the secret passages beneath the town's oldest buildings, the community's wonder turned to fear. By Christmas, 2 men would vanish, a prominent family would be ruined, and Clara Whitmore herself would disappear into the Maine wilderness, leaving behind only a collection of maps that no one dared to follow. Before we continue with the haunting story of Clara Whitmore and the buried secrets her extraordinary mind uncovered in Port Harmon's rocky shores, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most chilling historical mysteries every week, and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. What the residents of Port Harmon didn't realize was that Clara's gift would expose a network of smuggling, conspiracy, and murder that had been carefully concealed for nearly 2 decades, and that her uncanny spatial awareness would become their community's most dangerous secret. Port Harmon, Maine, in 1891, was a town built on granite and secrets. Perched on the rocky Atlantic coast 60 miles north of Portland, its 3,000 residents made their living from fishing, shipbuilding, and the kind of quiet coastal trade that didn't always appear in official ledgers. The town's weathered clapboard houses clung to steep hillsides that descended to a natural harbor, where fishing boats and trading vessels sheltered from the relentless Atlantic storms. Captain Jonathan Whitmore had settled in Port Harmon in 1872, bringing with him his young wife Elizabeth and a reputation as a skilled navigator who had sailed routes from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. He found work piloting trading vessels through the treacherous coastal waters, while Elizabeth taught at the small schoolhouse that served the town's children. They lived in a modest cottage on Prospect Street, with a clear view of the harbor and the lighthouse that marked the entrance to safe anchorage. Clara had been born in 1878, 6 years after the Whitmores' arrival, during an autumn storm so violent that no midwife could reach their cottage. Elizabeth had delivered the child alone, while Jonathan paced the floor below, listening to the wind tear at their roof and his wife's cries of pain. The baby had been small and blue when she finally emerged, so still that Jonathan feared she was dead. But Elizabeth had worked over the tiny form with desperate determination, and finally Clara had drawn her first gasping breath. From her earliest years, Clara was different. While other toddlers played with dolls and wooden toys, she was obsessed with lines and angles. She would trace the patterns of floorboards with her fingers for hours, or sit motionless, studying the way shadows fell across walls as the sun moved through the sky. By age 4, she could draw remarkably accurate floor plans of their cottage and neighboring houses, including details she couldn't possibly have observed from her limited vantage point. Elizabeth, who had studied art before her marriage, encouraged Clara's drawing abilities, providing her daughter with paper, pencils, and charcoal. But she began to feel uneasy when Clara started producing maps of places the family had never visited, detailed street layouts of distant towns, floor plans of ships that had never docked in Port Harmon, and topographical sketches of inland regions that Clara had no way of knowing existed. The town initially viewed Clara's abilities with benign curiosity. When she correctly drew a map showing where old Mrs. Fletcher's silver locket had fallen through a gap in her porch floorboards, people were impressed. When she sketched the interior of the abandoned Preston mansion on the hill, including a hidden room that local children had never discovered, people began to wonder. But when she produced a detailed chart showing the exact location of Thomas Gray's fishing traps, which he had deliberately kept secret from competing fishermen, people started to feel uneasy. The winter of 1890 to 91 had been particularly harsh, with storms that kept boats in harbor for weeks at a time. The economic pressure created by lost fishing opportunities made Port Harmon's residents irritable and suspicious. It was during this isolated winter that Clara's drawings began to take on a darker character, revealing secrets that some people desperately wanted to keep hidden. Clara had developed the habit of sitting in her attic room, sketching by lamplight while her parents worked below. She produced maps with obsessive focus, her thin fingers moving across paper with mechanical precision, creating documents of such detail and accuracy that they looked like professional surveyor's work rather than the productions of a 13-year-old girl. Elizabeth began to notice that Clara's maps were becoming increasingly complex and disturbing. The girl would draw elaborate underground tunnel systems beneath Port Harmon's streets, detailed floor plans of houses, including secret compartments and hidden spaces, and topographical maps marking locations with symbols that seemed to indicate buried objects. When Elizabeth asked what the symbols meant, Clara would simply say that she was mapping what was there, whether visible or not. The transformation from curiosity to dread began on a gray February morning in 1891. Clara came down from her attic room carrying a rolled map, which she spread across the kitchen table with her characteristic methodical precision. "Mama," she said in her quiet, measured voice, "I've drawn something important that needs to be shown to the authorities." Elizabeth looked at the map and felt her blood run cold. It was an extraordinarily detailed chart of Port Harmon's waterfront, showing not just the visible docks and warehouses, but an elaborate system of underground passages connecting specific buildings to hidden coves along the rocky shoreline. Various locations were marked with symbols and notations in Clara's neat handwriting. Contraband storage, transfer point, false wall concealing passage entrance. "Clara, where did you learn about these passages? Have you been exploring dangerous places?" Elizabeth's voice trembled with fear for her daughter's safety. Clara looked at her mother with those dark, intense eyes that always seemed to be calculating distances and angles. "I haven't been anywhere, Mama. I can see these spaces in my mind, the way buildings connect, the way tunnels would naturally form through the granite, the logical points where people would create hidden passages. It's all mathematical. Angles and distances and structural probability. These passages exist. I'm certain of it." Elizabeth realized with growing horror that her daughter wasn't reporting direct observation, but rather was somehow deducing or calculating the existence of a hidden smuggling network based purely on spatial analysis and architectural logic. The precision of the map, with its exact measurements and detailed annotations, suggested this was far more than childish imagination. That evening, when Jonathan returned from the harbor, Elizabeth showed him Clara's map. Captain Whitmore, who had sailed the world's oceans and navigated by the stars, recognized the professional quality of the cartography immediately. More troubling, he recognized several of the locations Clara had marked as belonging to some of Port Harmon's most prominent citizens. "If this map is accurate," he said slowly, "Clara has uncovered a smuggling operation involving at least a dozen of the town's leading men. The warehouse marked here belongs to Alderman Prescott. This building is owned by Judge Morrison, and this passage supposedly connects to the basement of the First Maritime Bank, where Harrison Blackwood serves as president." Jonathan looked at his daughter's calm, calculating face and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Maine winter. "Clara, you must tell me the truth. How did you create this map?" Clara's explanation was delivered with the same precise, unemotional tone she always used when discussing her spatial observations. "I've been studying the architecture of Port Harmon for years, Papa. Every building, every street, every natural feature. I notice when buildings have cellars that extend beyond their foundations, when warehouse floors sound hollow in specific patterns, when certain businesses receive shipments that don't match their visible inventory." She pointed to various locations on her map. The granite formations along the coast have natural fissures that could easily be expanded into passages. I calculated the most probable routes based on geological structure and observed foot traffic patterns. Then I correlated this data with economic anomalies, businesses that appear more prosperous than their legitimate trade would support, families whose spending doesn't match their official income. Jonathan felt the same combination of pride and terror that had become familiar since Clara's abilities had first manifested. His 13-year-old daughter had apparently conducted a sophisticated analysis of Port Harmon's economic and architectural landscape, deducing the existence of a criminal conspiracy through pure spatial reasoning and observational logic. "Clara, these are very serious accusations against powerful men. If your map is wrong, we could face severe consequences. If it's right, we may face even worse." Clara rolled up her map with careful precision. "The probability of accuracy is 92%, Papa. I've cross-referenced multiple data sources, but I understand that revealing this information will create danger for our family. I calculated that probability as well. It's 87% likely that the conspirators will take action against us within 72 hours of this map becoming public." The casual way Clara discussed the probability of threats against their family filled Jonathan with dread. His daughter's extraordinary spatial abilities had apparently led her to uncover Port Harmon's darkest secret, and her mathematical mind had already calculated the deadly consequences that would follow. As he looked at the detailed map spread across their kitchen table, Captain Jonathan Whitmore realized that his family stood at a crossroads. They could destroy Clara's map and pretend ignorance, allowing the smuggling operation to continue unchecked. Or they could reveal what Clara had discovered, exposing corruption, but almost certainly making themselves targets of men who had already demonstrated their willingness to operate outside the law. The choice he made would determine not just their family's fate, but would set in motion a sequence of events that would tear Port Harmon apart and ultimately erase Clara Whitmore from history as completely as if she had never existed. The weight of Clara's discovery hung over the Whitmore household like the fog that rolled in from the Atlantic each evening. Jonathan spent a sleepless night studying his daughter's map, comparing it against his own knowledge of Port Harmon's layout and history. The more he examined Clara's work, the more convinced he became of its accuracy. The passages she had drawn corresponded perfectly with old rumors he had heard during his years in port, whispered stories of smuggling operations that had supposedly ended decades ago, but perhaps had simply become more carefully concealed. Elizabeth found herself watching Clara with new eyes, seeing not just her quiet, unusual daughter, but something approaching fear at what the girl's mind could accomplish. Clara continued her daily routine with unchanged precision, spending hours in her attic room producing more maps, each one revealing another layer of Port Harmon's hidden architecture. The morning after Clara had presented her smuggling map, she came downstairs with another document that made her parents' situation even more complicated. This one was a detailed floor plan of the Blackwood Mansion, the largest house in Port Harmon, belonging to Harrison Blackwood, the banker Jonathan had identified as one of the men implicated in the smuggling operation. "Clara, why did you draw this?" Elizabeth asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Because the Blackwood house contains the central repository," Clara replied in her matter-of-fact tone. "If you look at the spatial relationships between all the smuggling locations, they form a network with a logical center point. The Blackwood Mansion sits at the geometric center, and the architecture includes spaces that don't correspond to the visible structure." She pointed to a section of her drawing. "Here, on the second floor, there appears to be a room approximately 20 feet by 15 feet that has no corresponding windows or doors on the exterior, a hidden chamber. Based on the logical flow of the smuggling operation, this is where records and valuable contraband would be stored before distribution." Jonathan studied the drawing and realized Clara was right. He had been inside the Blackwood Mansion years ago for a social gathering, and he remembered thinking the hallway seemed oddly shortened, as if the house's exterior dimensions didn't quite match its interior layout. His daughter had identified a hidden room that he had vaguely sensed but never consciously recognized. "Clara," he said carefully, "have you shown these maps to anyone else?" "No, Papa, but Alderman Prescott's daughter, Margaret, saw me sketching the waterfront from the schoolhouse window last week. She asked what I was drawing, and I told her it was a map of the underground passages. I didn't realize at the time that her father was involved in the smuggling operation. Based on her reaction and the speed with which she left, I calculate an 85% probability that she reported this conversation to her father." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. If Prescott knew that Clara was mapping the smuggling network, the 72-hour warning Clara had calculated might already be counting down. That afternoon, Jonathan made a decision that would determine his family's fate. He took Clara's maps to Josiah Winters, the U.S. Customs inspector stationed in Port Harmon. Winters was not a local man. He had been appointed from Boston 2 years earlier, and Jonathan hoped that his outsider status might mean he wasn't part of the smuggling conspiracy. Winters examined Clara's maps in his small office above the harbormaster's quarters, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Captain Whitmore, if these maps are accurate, we're looking at a smuggling operation that has likely been running for decades. The sophistication of these passages, the number of prominent citizens involved, this is extraordinary. But I must ask, how did your 13-year-old daughter create such detailed documentation of places she presumably has never visited?" Jonathan explained Clara's unusual abilities as best he could, her obsessive spatial awareness, her ability to deduce structural features through observation and mathematical calculation, her maps of places she had never physically explored that had nonetheless proven accurate. Winters listened with the practiced skepticism of a career investigator. But something in Jonathan's earnestness seemed to convince him. "I will need to verify this information before I can take official action. But, Captain, if your daughter has indeed uncovered what she claims, you need to understand that the men involved will not hesitate to protect their operation. I've investigated smuggling rings before. They don't leave witnesses." "Clara calculated that we would be in danger," Jonathan admitted. "She gave it an 87% probability within 72 hours of the maps becoming public." Winters raised an eyebrow. "Your daughter calculates probability percentages for threats against your family?" "She calculates everything, Inspector. It's how her mind works." That evening, as the Whitmore family gathered for dinner, Clara made another of her unsettling announcements. She had been studying the coastal charts in her father's navigation books, and she looked up from her plate with those dark, calculating eyes. "Papa, there will be a landing tonight at Widow's Cove. A ship will arrive at approximately 11:47 p.m., calculated based on current weather patterns and tidal conditions. The smugglers will transfer cargo through the passage that connects to the Blackwood warehouse. I estimate 14 to 17 men will be involved." Jonathan stared at his daughter. "Clara, how could you possibly know a smuggling operation is planned for tonight?" Clara's explanation was delivered with her characteristic precision. "I've been observing the patterns for months. The smuggling operations occur on a regular schedule tied to the lunar cycle, specifically during the dark of the moon when the coastline is least visible from sea. We're currently 3 days past new moon, which historically has been the preferred time. Additionally, I observed increased activity at the Blackwood warehouse yesterday. 6 men visited who normally have no business there, and all stayed for exactly 17 minutes, suggesting a planning meeting." She consulted a small notebook she always carried. "Furthermore, I've been monitoring the shipping schedules from the harbor master's posted documents. There are no legitimate vessels expected tonight, but I calculated the arrival time of an unscheduled ship based on typical smuggling routes from Canadian waters. The probability of a landing tonight is 93%. Elizabeth put down her fork, her appetite completely gone. "Jonathan, she's been watching these criminals for months. If they know, if they realize she's been documenting their patterns." The knock at their door came at exactly that moment, as if summoned by Elizabeth's fears. Jonathan opened it to find Inspector Winters standing in the evening gloom, accompanied by 2 federal marshals from Portland. "Captain Whitmore," Winters said urgently, "we need to move your family to a safe location immediately." I made some discreet inquiries this afternoon based on your daughter's maps, and I've confirmed enough to warrant a federal investigation. But word has spread. One of the men I questioned apparently sent a warning to the others. If Clara's calculations about tonight's smuggling operation are accurate, we have an opportunity to catch them in the act. But your family cannot be here when that happens. Within 30 minutes, the Whitmores had packed essential belongings and were being escorted to a hotel in the next town, guarded by federal marshals. Clara brought her collection of maps, carefully rolled and tied with string, treating them with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. As their wagon pulled away from Prospect Street, Clara looked back at Port Harmon's waterfront and made one final observation that would haunt her parents for the rest of their lives. "Mama, Papa, even if the smugglers are caught tonight, this won't end well for us. I've calculated multiple scenarios. The conspiracy involves too many prominent citizens. Even if some are arrested, others will escape, and they will know that my maps made their exposure possible. The probability of us being able to return to Port Harmon safely is less than 12%. Jonathan pulled his daughter close, feeling the thin, fragile form that somehow contained a mind capable of unraveling complex criminal conspiracies through pure spatial reasoning. "We'll be safe, Clara. The law will protect us." But even as he said it, Jonathan knew his daughter's calculations were probably more accurate than his hopeful reassurances. Clara's extraordinary abilities had revealed secrets that powerful men had spent decades concealing, and mathematical probability suggested they would not forgive or forget. That night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., a ship dropped anchor off Widow's Cove, just as Clara had calculated. Federal agents and marshals, positioned based on the passages marked on Clara's maps, raided the smuggling operation and arrested 14 men, including Alderman Prescott and 2 members of Judge Morrison's staff. The seizure of contraband and documentation would eventually implicate over 20 Port Harmon residents in a smuggling network that had operated for nearly 30 years. But Harrison Blackwood, the banker at the center of Clara's spatial analysis, was not among those arrested. By the time federal agents reached his mansion, Blackwood had disappeared, along with his family, and presumably the contents of the hidden room Clara had identified in her floor plan. And Clara's calculation that their family could not safely return to Port Harmon would prove terribly, precisely accurate. The federal investigation that followed the raid on Widow's Cove became the largest criminal case in Maine's history. The documentation seized from the arrested smugglers revealed a conspiracy that extended beyond Port Harmon, involving corrupt officials in 3 counties and trading networks that reached from the Canadian Maritimes to Boston. But at the center of the prosecution's case were Clara Whitmore's maps, documents so detailed and accurate that they became both celebrated evidence and a source of deep unease. The trial was scheduled for early December in Portland. The Whitmore family remained under federal protection in Augusta, where they had been relocated for their safety. Clara continued her obsessive drawing, now mapping their temporary surroundings with the same precision she had applied to Port Harmon. She produced detailed floor plans of the hotel, topographical maps of Augusta's streets, and architectural analyses of neighboring buildings, her mind unable to stop calculating spatial relationships, even in this unfamiliar environment. Elizabeth watched her daughter with growing concern. Clara rarely played, never formed friendships with other children, and seemed to exist in a world of angles, distances, and geometric probability. The girl's extraordinary abilities had exposed a criminal conspiracy, but Elizabeth wondered at what cost to Clara's own humanity. "She's becoming more withdrawn," Elizabeth confided to Jonathan one evening after Clara had gone to bed. "It's as if the more she focuses on mapping external spaces, the more she loses connection to the internal space of normal human emotion." Jonathan had no answer. He had been spending his days working with federal prosecutors, explaining Clara's methods and defending the validity of her maps against defense attorneys who argued that no child could produce such sophisticated cartography without direct criminal involvement. The suggestion that the Whitmores themselves might be part of the smuggling operation had been raised and dismissed, but the shadow of suspicion remained. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. One of the arrested smugglers, a warehouse worker named Thomas Garrett, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony confirmed that Harrison Blackwood had indeed been the operation's organizer, and that the hidden chamber Clara had identified in her floor plan of the Blackwood mansion existed exactly as she had drawn it. "Blackwood showed it to us once," Garrett testified in his deposition. "Wanted us to understand he kept records on everyone involved, insurance against betrayal. The room was accessed through a false panel in the upstairs hallway, exactly where the girl's map showed it. How she knew about it without ever being in the house, it scared the hell out of Blackwood when Prescott told him about her maps. He knew if she could identify that hidden chamber, she could probably find everything else he'd concealed." This testimony prompted federal investigators to conduct a thorough search of the abandoned Blackwood mansion. Using Clara's floor plan as a guide, they found not just the hidden chamber, but an even more disturbing discovery: a second concealed space in the basement that Clara had not mapped because it was older than the smuggling operation and buried deeper in the granite foundation. The second hidden chamber contained skeletal remains. Inspector Winters came to Augusta personally to inform the Whitmores of this grim discovery. He met with Jonathan privately in the hotel's small sitting room, his expression grave. "Captain Whitmore, we found 2 bodies concealed in the Blackwood Mansion's foundation. Based on the state of decomposition and the personal effects found with them, we believe they've been there for approximately 15 to 20 years. We're working to identify them, but we have reason to believe they were rival smugglers who threatened Blackwood's operation years ago." Jonathan felt the weight of this revelation pressing down on him. Does Clara need to testify about this? The prosecutor believes Clara's spatial analysis will be crucial to the murder investigation as well. If she could calculate the existence of one hidden chamber without ever entering the building, the jury needs to understand that her methods, however unusual, are reliable. "But Captain," Winters hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, "there's been talk. Some people are saying Clara's abilities aren't natural, that no child could possess such knowledge without some form of supernatural involvement." "She's not supernatural," Jonathan said firmly. "Her mind simply works differently. She sees spatial relationships the way a musician hears notes or a mathematician understands numbers. It's extraordinary, but it's not witchcraft. Winters nodded, but his expression remained troubled. I believe you, Captain, but the defense attorneys will exploit any doubt they can create. And there's something else you need to know. Harrison Blackwood's last known location was in St. John, New Brunswick. He's beyond our legal reach now. But witnesses report he's been making inquiries about your family's location. The implication was clear. Blackwood knew that Clara's maps had destroyed his operation and exposed his crimes, including murder, and he was looking for them. That evening, Jonathan made a decision he had been avoiding for weeks. He asked Clara to create one final map, a detailed analysis of the Blackwood mansion, showing not just the chambers she had already identified, but any other concealed spaces her spatial reasoning suggested might exist. Clara worked through the night, her thin fingers moving across paper with mechanical precision, creating a document that represented perhaps the most sophisticated architectural analysis ever produced by a 13-year-old mind. When she finally descended from her room the next morning, she presented her parents with a map that made Jonathan's blood run cold. In addition to the 2 hidden chambers already discovered, Clara had identified 5 more concealed spaces within the Blackwood mansion. 3 false walls containing hidden compartments, 1 bricked-up passage in the cellar, and most disturbingly, an unmarked sub-basement that her calculations suggested lay even deeper beneath the foundation. The mansion's architecture contains multiple anomalies, Clara explained in her emotionless tone. The pattern suggests systematic concealment over decades. Mr. Blackwood didn't just hide smuggled goods. He built an entire architecture of deception, layer upon layer, each space concealing something more valuable or incriminating than the last. She pointed to the deepest chamber on her map. This space is the oldest and most carefully concealed. Based on the structural supports and the way the foundation settles, I calculate it was built when the mansion was originally constructed in 1847. Whatever is hidden there is important enough that 3 generations of Blackwoods protected its location. Jonathan stared at his daughter's map, understanding that Clara had uncovered something far more significant than a simple smuggling operation. The Blackwood family had been hiding secrets for nearly half a century, and Clara's extraordinary spatial awareness had peeled back the layers of deception like an anatomist dissecting a body. Federal investigators returned to the Blackwood mansion with Clara's new map, and over the course of 3 days, they systematically excavated the spaces she had identified. Each discovery confirmed her calculations. The false walls contained financial documents detailing decades of criminal activity. The bricked-up passage led to a natural cave that had been used for contraband storage since before the Civil War. And the sub-basement contained something that transformed the case into a national scandal. Inspector Winters made a second trip to Augusta, but this time he asked to speak with Clara directly, despite Jonathan's protective objections. "Miss Whitmore," Winters said, sitting across from the slight girl with the calculating eyes, "I need you to understand what you've uncovered. The deepest chamber beneath the Blackwood mansion contained documents proving that Harrison Blackwood's grandfather, Jeremiah Blackwood, who served as Port Harmon's mayor from 1847 to 1863, embezzled over $200,000 in federal harbor improvement funds. That money was never accounted for, and its theft nearly bankrupted the town in the 1860s. Clara nodded, showing no surprise. The architecture suggested something of major historical significance. A chamber that deep and that carefully concealed wouldn't be built for routine smuggling contraband. It had to protect something that could destroy the entire family if discovered. Winters studied the strange child before him, this girl who processed human evil as casually as she calculated architectural geometry. Clara, how did you know where to look? What process does your mind follow to identify hidden spaces? Clara's explanation was delivered with the same precise, clinical tone she always used. I observe the visible architecture and calculate what the invisible structure must be to support it.
When buildings have cellars deeper than their foundations should require, or rooms whose dimensions don't match their exterior walls, or support beams positioned for loads that the visible structure doesn't create, it means something is hidden. The mathematics of architecture are as precise as any other mathematics. Anomalies indicate deception. And you can see these anomalies just by looking at buildings? I see them in my mind, the same way you might remember a melody or recall a conversation. When I look at a building, I automatically calculate its structural logic. Anything that violates that logic becomes obvious, the way a wrong note in a musical phrase would be obvious to a trained musician. Winters sat back, finally beginning to understand the truly extraordinary nature of Clara's abilities. She wasn't just observing or even deducing. Her mind was processing architecture as a complex mathematical system, automatically detecting inconsistencies that indicated hidden spaces or concealed structures. Clara, your maps have uncovered a smuggling network, exposed 2 murders, and revealed financial crimes that span 50 years. The trial will depend heavily on your testimony. Are you prepared for what that will mean? You'll be questioned by defense attorneys who will try to make you seem unreliable or somehow complicit. They may try to suggest your abilities are impossible, or that you must have had help from adults involved in the crimes. Clara looked at Inspector Winters with those dark, calculating eyes. I calculate the probability of successfully testifying at 76%. The risk of hostile cross-examination is balanced against the mathematical certainty of my maps. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Winters, even when people do. But Clara's final calculation about her testimony would prove as tragically accurate as all her other predictions. She would never get the chance to take the witness stand. The trial was scheduled to begin on December 15th, 1891. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Clara's maps, but the defense team had been preparing a sophisticated challenge to her credibility. Led by Cyrus Thatcher, the most prominent attorney in Maine, the defense planned to argue that Clara's maps were either fabricated by adults seeking to frame innocent men, or were the products of a disturbed child's imagination rather than reliable evidence. The week before the trial, Jonathan received an unsigned letter delivered to their Augusta hotel. Captain Whitmore, your daughter has destroyed lives with her drawings. Consider carefully whether pursuing this prosecution is worth the price your family will pay. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. A friend. The threat was clear enough that Jonathan immediately contacted Inspector Winters, who assigned additional federal marshals to guard the Whitmores. But Clara, when shown the letter, simply noted that it contained 3 specific grammatical constructions that indicated the writer was educated in British colonial schools, narrowing the likely author to one of 5 possible individuals she had identified through her analysis of Port Harmon's social structure. "It's probably Harrison Blackwood himself," she said calmly. "The letter's phrasing matches the business correspondence I observed in his office window from the street. I sketched samples last summer when I was mapping the commercial district. His handwriting formed patterns I can still visualize." Elizabeth had finally reached her breaking point. "Clara, you were observing and memorizing a man's handwriting through his office window, without him knowing you were studying him. Don't you understand how disturbing that is?" For the first time, Clara's emotionless facade cracked slightly. "I don't mean to disturb people, Mama. I just see patterns everywhere. I can't help but map them. It's like asking you not to see the color of the sky or hear the sound of the ocean." The spatial relationships, the architectural logic, the behavioral patterns, they're all just there, visible to me in ways I can't ignore or forget. It was the closest Clara had ever come to explaining the burden of her extraordinary abilities, and Elizabeth felt her heart break for this strange, isolated child who experienced the world through mathematical precision rather than emotional connection. The night before they were scheduled to travel to Portland for the trial's opening, Clara spent hours in her room working on a map that she wouldn't show her parents. She finally emerged after midnight, finding Jonathan still awake and reviewing his testimony notes. "Papa," she said quietly, "I've been calculating probabilities for all possible outcomes of the trial. The mathematics are clear. Even if we testify successfully and the smugglers are convicted, our family will never be safe. Too many people have been implicated. Too many powerful families have been ruined. The probability of retaliation approaches certainty." Jonathan pulled his daughter close, feeling her fragile frame trembling slightly. "Clara, the law will protect us. Justice must be served." "Justice is a human concept, Papa. It doesn't follow mathematical principles. The numbers suggest a different course of action." Before Jonathan could ask what she meant, Clara kissed his cheek, a rare gesture of affection from a child who usually avoided physical contact, and returned to her room. The next morning, Clara Whitmore was gone. Her room had been methodically emptied of her maps, drawing supplies, and personal belongings. The federal marshals stationed outside the hotel swore no one had entered or exited through the main doors. But when investigators examined Clara's room, they found something that explained her impossible disappearance. Sketched on the back of her bedroom door was a detailed architectural drawing of the hotel's structure, including a service passage behind the walls that connected to a laundry chute descending to the basement. Clara had mapped her own escape route with the same precision she applied to everything else. The only item she left behind was a single map spread carefully on her bed where her parents would find it. The document showed a route through the Maine wilderness, marked with campsites, water sources, and safe passages through terrain that would be nearly impossible for pursuers to follow. At the top, in Clara's neat handwriting, was a message: "Papa and Mama, I have calculated that my testimony will endanger you both without ultimately ensuring justice. The defense has prepared arguments that will discredit my maps regardless of their accuracy. The probability of conviction is only 47%, even with my testimony, but the probability of retaliation against our family is 93%, whether the defendants are convicted or not. I have chosen a different solution to the mathematical problem. Without me, the prosecutors must rely on other evidence, which may be sufficient for conviction of the primary conspirators. More importantly, without me, you are no longer targets for those who fear my observations. I have maps that will guide me to safety. Do not search for me. The probability of successful pursuit is less than 8%, and the attempt would only draw attention to my location. My mind has always set me apart from normal human connection. Perhaps it is better that I exist in the spaces between maps, where patterns are clear and calculations are certain. I love you both, though I understand I have never expressed that emotion in conventional ways. Thank you for accepting what I am, even when it frightened you.
Clara Jonathan and Elizabeth Whitmore spent the rest of their lives searching for their daughter. But Clara had calculated her disappearance as precisely as she had mapped everything else. Inspector Winters launched an extensive investigation, but the wilderness route on Clara's map led federal agents through terrain so difficult that they eventually had to abandon the pursuit. The trial proceeded without Clara's testimony. Surprisingly, the prosecution's case proved stronger than her calculations had suggested. Several additional smugglers agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences, and the documentary evidence seized from the Blackwood mansion was damning enough to secure convictions. Alderman Prescott received 15 years. Judge Morrison was disbarred and imprisoned. A dozen others served various sentences. But Harrison Blackwood was never captured. Rumors placed him in New Brunswick, then Scotland, then disappeared entirely from the historical record. And Clara Whitmore vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Extensive searches of the Maine wilderness found no trace of her. Some believed she had died in the harsh winter conditions. Others thought she might have been taken by one of Blackwood's associates seeking revenge. But a few wondered if perhaps Clara's extraordinary spatial abilities had allowed her to navigate to safety in ways that normal minds could never follow or understand. In the years following Clara's disappearance, occasional reports surfaced of a young woman matching her description working as a cartographer in remote locations. A survey team in the Montana Territories mentioned a silent assistant with extraordinary mapping skills. A Canadian railroad company noted an unusual consultant who could visualize tunnel routes through mountains with uncanny accuracy. An architect in San Francisco praised a draftsman whose floor plans were so precise they seemed almost supernatural. But none of these sightings could ever be confirmed, and they eventually faded into rumor and speculation. Jonathan Whitmore died in 1903, having never stopped searching for his daughter. His final words to Elizabeth were, "She calculated her escape perfectly. Maybe we should trust that she calculated her survival just as well." Elizabeth lived until 1921,
maintaining a small cottage in Augusta, where she kept Clara's childhood drawings carefully preserved. Researchers who examined them decades later were astounded by the sophistication of the cartography and architectural analysis. Several maps Clara had drawn as a child were later confirmed to be accurate down to inches when compared against professional surveys. Among Elizabeth's papers, discovered after her death, was a final letter that had arrived anonymously in 1907. It contained no signature, only a map showing a small homestead in the Canadian Rockies, with a single notation in familiar, neat handwriting. Safe, content, still mapping. The truth of Clara Whitmore's fate remains unknown. She vanished from history as completely as the hidden chambers her maps had revealed, leaving behind only her extraordinary drawings and the mystery of what a mind like hers might accomplish when freed from the constraints of conventional society. Modern neurologists who have studied the surviving accounts of Clara's abilities suggest she may have had what we would now recognize as a form of high-functioning autism combined with exceptional visual spatial intelligence. A mind that processed architecture and geography with the same intuitive certainty that others might process language or music. To the people of 1891, such abilities seemed almost supernatural. But Clara understood her gift in purely mathematical terms. She simply saw patterns that others could not, and mapped spaces that others did not know existed.
The case of Clara Whitmore reminds us that extraordinary abilities can be both gift and curse, that some minds operate according to logic we may never fully understand, and that the most detailed maps sometimes lead to destinations we cannot follow. What happened to the cartographer's daughter after she walked into the Maine wilderness remains one of America's most intriguing unsolved mysteries. But perhaps the most important question is not where Clara went, but what she might have been mapping during all those years that followed her disappearance. After all, a mind that could reveal smuggling networks, hidden chambers, and 50 years of buried secrets was surely capable of calculating a future that the rest of us could never visualize or predict. What do you think happened to Clara Whitmore? Did she survive in the wilderness using her extraordinary spatial abilities? Or did the harsh Maine winter claim her before she could reach safety? Share your theories in the comments below. If you found this story as haunting as we did, subscribe to our channel for more mysteries from America's hidden history.